I love the concept of active hope. Hope is not inert. Hope is not some sedentary thing. Hope takes work.
And sometimes you need a little bit of hope as that North Star to continue pushing yourself forward and your mission forward and your work forward.
I am most interested in the everyday voice. The kind of gems that you receive from people who are out there struggling, living life. That's where the juice is at.
My name is Marc Bamuthi Joseph. I am a poet. I'm a dad. I'm an educator.
I am Kamilah Forbes. I am a storyteller, a director, a producer, a wife, a mother, a daughter, and the executive producer of the Apollo Theater.
My name is Paola Prestini. I'm a composer, and I love to curate and nurture new work. I'm a mother, a wife, and a collaborator.
There aren't a lot of working artists that also run cultural institutions.
As three hosts who are both artists and leaders, to be frank, artists are out there constantly exposed to failure, to judgment, and to evolution.
We work on very much erasing boundaries. What I'm hoping we can do is sort of break open these worlds of curiosity and lead us on new and unexpected paths.
For the Kennedy Center.
For National Sawdust.
For the Apollo Theater.
This is Active Hope.
Good afternoon, friends.
Hello. Oh.
Good to see you both. I feel like every time we get together, a million historic things have happened. And I greet you with a tender heart. It's been quite a week.
That it has. That it absolutely has. It's I that word tender is really critical right now, right? Like for all of us, right? To have just grace with one another. To heal,
Exactly.
In a week.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And
healing, present, progressive. Healing is active.
That's right.
And enduring.
That's right.
This episode I feel is very much about regeneration, and and it's also very personal, as you both know. So I just thank you in advance for bearing with me for the past month and a half, as I've told you so much about why the border is so personal to me. And I'm going to tell our audience just a little bit about what we're going to hear. And as I mentioned, this episode is very personal. As a child, I landed on the U.S.-Mexico border in a town called Nogales. And it was something about that town, the division, the disparate synergies, the wishes, the dreams, the songs, the struggles, that has essentially informed every aspect of my DNA. We had immigrated from Italy for a life on the border. My father is an instrument and reed maker, and the cane that's used for his product is actually grown in northern Mexico. And the promise for a better future was there. But as soon as we arrived, my parents separated, and my mother and I began our life, and it had a lot of uncertainty. I remember to this day, she packed our car with all of our belongings to try and make it in California. And I remember believing that everything I needed was in that car. And there was a song that I tried to look for and I can't find, and it was "You're My Number One." And we soon made it back to the border. We didn't make it, but she succeeded at the immigrant's dream. She had to build new roots, and that has informed how I approach my life to this day. So today, we're going to take a picture of what it means to be on the border, from immigration to migration, from fleeing to freedom, to being stuck, and all of the realities. Bamuthi, you said something last week that I loved, which is that the immigrant DNA is powered by hope, but it's also powered by sacrifice, and at times by secrecy. And immigration, which is a national issue, is this border town's everyday issue, but they don't get that support. Just in March, they recorded 19,000 children in one, just 19,000 children in one day trying to pass the border, fleeing from poverty and violence. And I really just don't think that as a country that's built on immigration, on migration, on stolen land, on bodies, we can't turn a blind eye. So I'm really excited to build with both of you a deeper sense of understanding of the borders, the empathy that's needed, the strategy that's needed to look at the borders and listen to the lessons they can teach us. And what translations can we find to institution building in the name of better systems? So today we're going to actually focus on something that brings me great hope. Two guests. One is Mayor Regina Romero from Tucson, and she's incredible, and a good friend, Evan Corey, who's down on the border and really building new possibilities through art. But before we get there, I want to ask both of you what borders mean to you in your practice and as human beings.
Wow. First of all, thank you for your bravery. And I feel called to note the idea of blood memory, which I want to say is something that I first encountered in literature through Alice Walker, through Toni Morrison. But the idea that we carry the traumas of our ancestors and also the possibility inherent and embedded in the journeys of our ancestors in our own practices. The idea of borders are definitely geographical, but I don't know, when you ask that question, I just can't help but think of hip hop. Planet hip hop, planet rock as a borderless nation of culture makers.
Yeah.
I think of the Black Planet also as borderless. And maybe, with hip hop in particular, it's a culture that emerged because of very, very sharply drawn borders of gang territories in the South Bronx. And without those sharp borders and the intra-community, communal borders, and the need to find peace because of broader crossings, between Black and brown folks, maybe we don't have the culture that has changed my life. But then I also think about diaspora and sounds like Bob Marley and sounds like Fela Kuti and sounds like Miriam Makeba, sounds like Lauryn Hill that have managed to circumnavigate the planet. And maybe that's where art lives, is that there are all these sharply drawn borders, and we'll talk about the borders of our own families in a minute. But that is the thing about the art that I love, and maybe the cultural practice that I come from, is that it is, if it's not borderless, it does a pretty good job of obliterating borders, for which I'm really thankful. Kim, how about you?
Man, so beautifully said. And Paola, thank you for that, just introduction to the concept of borders from a geographic standpoint, because I do think that, and also the invitation to talk about it in our practice. I think, me personally, I've always, I've always I've resisted silos, resisted restriction, whether those restrictions were, enforced, whether those restrictions were, whether it's geographic, whether it was disciplinarian, right? Whether it was to be in one discipline or not, which is, I've always existed outside of those, or at least I think that my practice is all about how do we erase or rise above, or to use your word, obliterate, right? To transcend. I think that's our role. That's always been, I think, and it's interesting being an artist within an institution that exists against categories, categorical definitions, categorical silos, even from the sense of departmental.
Right.
I'm always interested in the conversation. Well, we are all here as creative beings to add to the stew that what it is that we're building is art in order and culture to move us forward. So whether you are in finance, development, marketing, PR, how do we build a cultural ecosystem even within the institution that looks like a creative collaboration, like within a rehearsal hall or a room of my dreams, right?
Yeah.
I'm always interested in that conversation.
You know, I love that moment in a collaboration where you trust somebody and you give something over. I always have a vision for what something's going to look like, but I know that the minute I give it over, that person's going to take it into some completely different place. And I think that, that kind of sense of wonder and of abandon and of trust is so crucial. And time, which I think when we get, later when we start to talk about institution building, the notion of this kind of change that we're talking about that we want to commit to, it actually takes time and it takes strategy, and it can't happen overnight, but it needs commitment. One clip that we're about to see is I traveled actually to the border to Nogales this past month. To visit a friend of mine named Evan Corey. And Evan graduated from Juilliard in piano. And I had heard that he had gone back to Nogales to start a whole bunch of different things. And I was really curious to catch up with him. And so we're going to actually hear Magos Herrera performing Gracias a la Vida by Violeta Parra. And she's with the Ed Simon Trio performing at Sawdust. And this is a little snapshot of life on the border and of this beautiful human being who's trying to regenerate through art.
Awesome. Thank you.
Gracias a la vida que me ha dado tanto, ya me dio dos luceros que cuando los abro.
Before I moved back to Nogales, I was in New York City for 13 years, and as far as my decision to move back, while living in New York, I just felt more and more drawn to home. And the whole reason I was able to study piano and music was because of our family stores that supported that journey. So eventually the opportunity came to move back. I was at a crossroads and I just went for it, and it's been one of the best decisions of my life, where I finally feel like I'm digging my feet into my community and growing as a person, as an artist.
Me ha dado el oído.
We're at our family store called Corey's. It's a bridal shop, and we've served this area for many decades. My grandparents started the store, and we are steps from the border here. This is one of the pedestrian crossings that is only for pedestrians, no vehicles. And we've noticed that it's a very popular spot for families to come together, because during the pandemic, the border has been closed. So Mexican citizens are not able to cross to this side of the border. So that means families are separated, friends, couples, or one person's on the other side, and so they're coming here to meet and talk. And I'm not certain of it, but I think not all of the border crossings have the ability to see through like this. So I think there's people coming from all over the state, probably, that this is their meeting point where they can actually see and potentially touch each other. And right before the border closed, we got notice that it was gonna happen. And our store, all of the bridal dresses are usually put on layaway months in advance, and people slowly build up to their wedding date. And so when we got news that the border was closing, we had to call all of the brides with their dresses that are on layaway here in Mexico to, come get your dresses now, because we don't know what's gonna happen. And there was a rush of brides, and And we're still actually coordinating with brides so that maybe a cousin that lives on this side can pick up for them and take it over there. And so, our little bridal store has a very unique perspective.
Playas y desiertos, montañas y llanos.
There's a lot going on in this border community, which doesn't get a lot of good attention often in the country. You hear about the border and it's always about issues with international border crisis or drugs or trafficking of all kinds. And really this community is so much more than that. Recently in 2018, there was razor wire attached to the border, which was one of the most aggressive things we've seen happen here at the border. And what's interesting is that shortly after that, a bunch of artists got together and opened up Lina Art Studio. So it was a direct response, I think, because we were thinking of ways to do maybe some public art that commented on the fact that we don't agree with the razor wire. And little by little, it evolved to like, hey, let's open up an art space. And one thing leads to the next. So it's you gotta make changes one step at a time. And I think that the connection that we can have between friends and fellow artists, I really appreciate more than ever now. The human condition makes us strive for connection between each other, and that gives me hope.
Gorgeous.
So beautiful.
There's so much to take
beautiful.
there.
Sure. I'm so drawn by I'm so drawn by the theme of intersection, right? How he talked about that space, the bride at the intersection of a bridal shop. Like, how poetic is that, right? One of the most, it would seem as a significant moment in a family's time, of etc., right?
Yeah.
That becomes the intersection of cultures, of people, of families, of countries, even. Powerful.
Yeah. Love stories and the consummation of love, birth stories, and the possibility inherent in a new life. There are certain things that are just part of the human experience that a border cannot cross. And maybe that is among the more violent aspects of borders, is that they are dehumanizing. They eliminate the narrative. They are it's I know I always go to literature, but it's a little like opening up a 300-page novel on page 270 and a character is drowning. You begin not even in the middle, you begin at the end of the narrative, and everything that's led up to that place of distress and of extreme struggle is taken out of the story. But a physical place like a bridal shop, you have a sense of a love that brought you to that place. Even if you don't know the full story, maybe it's in an arranged marriage between people that don't know each other. I mean, there are endless possibilities, but conventionally speaking, a bridal shop is a place of arrival because people have hope in one another, because people are people feel compelled to build a life together.
That's it. That's it.
So it's the middle of the story, but it's also the beginning.
Right.
Totally.
Right.
Totally. At the intersection in which families are separated, right? At the intersection
Well,
in
so
which
that's the thing, right? Which is one of the things that I think this, he paints so many things that I take from this, but on the very granular level, Nogales has a twin city. And because of this border closing for a year, the economy essentially has completely dried up. But the experiment of the idea of a twin city crossing two countries, what could it look like if it had actually, if it could thrive? And I think what I take from, what he says is that it's change one step at a time. It's going back to your community. It's saying, yes, I could be in New York, but I'm actually going to go here because I'm needed here. And I think one of the things that I've found the most difficult about having an immigrant identity is that I never feel like I can stop, and I never feel at home.
Yeah.
And that's just a reality. Like I always think, but maybe if I found the right place, it's not a thing that'll ever change. That's the immigrant DNA, is that it's the blessing because you get to see this kind of intersectionality that you're both talking about, and you get to see all these sides, but it's also it's complex.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. The itinerant being or the nomadic being, and even a nomadic sense is different than having a sense of home. I've been thinking about my institution, which, not being from Washington, D.C., and I should acknowledge that the Kennedy Center sits on unceded Piscataway territory. Not being from here, I don't really come to this place with a sense of intra-city borders. When I first got here, people said, well, the Kennedy Center is geographically isolated. And I'm like, no, it's not. You just take the blue line or the orange, like it's right there. But it is a place that's, in some cases, psychologically isolated. There's a desire for our institution to actually soften its white marble institutionality, become more porous, become more accessible, and to try to erode the psychological borders that surround it so that it has more of a sense of home. And that balance between the nomadic, the itinerant, the home to a few, and then home to many, a place of belonging where, as a cultural immigrant, you can find a different sense of home in this new place, is a lot of the work that we're doing in social impact, and a lot of the work, I think, of 21st century arts institutions that may also feel like, whether by virtue of history, legacy, price point, or aesthetic, are bordered within themselves.
Right.
And we're trying to break that down.
That's right. For necessity of existence, quite frankly. I mean, I think about that the difference of borders, I think, of breaking down borders in all of our institutions. But, when I think about, as you talk about the Kennedy Center, I think about that as relationship, even from the Apollo's perspective, where there's a border of legacy and history that is so rich and vibrant and a true definer. But at the same time, if we think about, how its porousness is what brought people to the institution and considered it home. The fact that the doors were open to all Black performers at a time in which they could not perform on any other stage in New York City. So, we are in the crux of a very similar challenge in that, how do we create space now for this generation of performers that is not independent of our history and legacy, but inclusive, right? So it's interesting, I think, challenge as we talk about borders, as we think about movement building, as we think about and just movements through time.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, Paola, we've been talking a lot about cultural borders and institutional borders. Both Kamilah and I are children of immigrants, and you yourself immigrated to this country. I feel so honored to be close to your story. Can you talk a little bit more about your recent experience and this very true harsh reality of a political border, particularly as we're experiencing it now in 2021?
Oh gosh, I mean, I feel like, it's interesting. It's interesting that you asked me that, because at the moment I feel a little not grounded in myself, in the sense that I think there are other things that need attention right now, and I want to be part of that change. So it's funny because, like, being able to express what I did at the opening feels really important, because I don't often talk about about my story. As a composer, you're not a performer. You know what I mean? Like, I just say it through my
Right.
music. But it felt really good to acknowledge that story exists. But something happened recently that really moved me, and I think I told you both that as part of going down to Arizona, my husband and I drove through the South. So we drove through Alabama, and we went to Montgomery, went to Selma, we saw the Legacy Museum. But the purpose of the stop in South Carolina was that my husband, who's half Black and half Japanese, has always felt like a satellite. He never knew his family. His father was adopted. His father's Black. And, not to tell his whole life story, but the point of this was that he has been looking for family for years on 23andMe, and he found them. And they were the most extraordinary, welcoming, beautiful people. And I hope they're listening right now, but they were amazing. But it made me realize how privileged I was to want to flee.
Wow.
And I just want to sit in that for a second, because, like, I want to escape. That's in my DNA. I always want to run. I'm not great at keeping in touch. I'm incredibly devoted, but I have a little bit of a fear of family, and it's a weird thing. And so all of a sudden, to see his joy in finding second, third cousins removed, when I have it and I keep running, was like, oh, that's privilege. Let's look at that fair and square. That then I have to address that psychologically. We're not going to do here. We can do that one day over drinks. But so when you ask me about being an immigrant now, I mean, to me, it's like, I'm lucky. My story is a lucky immigrant story. Let's face it. It's a beautiful, wonderful, lucky story. But there are many unlucky stories. And like the week we're living in, which it seems that every time we meet, there's, it's just the times we're living in it. There's always something huge. It's that's where the energy is devoted.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It makes all the sense.
Total sense. Yeah.
Is it time to announce our special guest?
Yeah,
I think it is. I think it is.
All right. Okay. So let me just find. I had written a little bit about her. So I was bowled over by Regina Romero. I had been following her for many years. And I'm just excited to share this interview. Before becoming the first Latina mayor of Tucson, Arizona, she was on the city council, where she led Tucson in becoming an immigrant welcoming city, and successfully led colleagues in passing a no border wall resolution. As mayor, she's believed deeply in delivering equity, inclusion, and opportunity for all, regardless of race, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, immigration status, religion, or background. And she has done incredible things, including prioritizing the creation of the City Race and Social Justice Initiative, including an immigrant advancement agenda, and something that I find particularly incredible because it hasn't been done, formalizing the governmental relationships with the Tohono O'odham and Pascua Yaqui tribes. The music I played for her in this clip is mine. It's performed by Roomful of Teeth, Jeffrey Zeigler, and Glenn Kothche, from the film The Colorado by Murat, Eyuboglus, which I produced and wrote music for. So let's watch. It is such an honor to have Mayor Regina Romero here with us on our third Active Hope podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a real honor.
Thank you so much for having me, Paola.
So I have just a few questions, and I really want to start with this idea of transformation. You ran for office on a platform focused on climate change, city infrastructure, and the economy, and then March 2020 happens. So I'm wondering, in what ways has COVID forced you to evolve your approach and your platform and search for new solutions? And how can we as leaders learn about adaptability and also about opposition and how to deal with it?
Well, yes, you're absolutely correct. I ran on a platform of climate change and climate action for the city of Tucson. And of course, our economy. And when the pandemic hit and we had to make absolutely incredibly difficult decisions, we really connected back to science, right? And that's one thing that this pandemic and climate change have in common, that it is science that should be dictating to us, the policymakers, the decision makers, in terms of where we go. And to be perfectly frank, the pandemic really highlighted the ills that society has been suffering from for so long, the inequities, discrepancies, but yet the pandemic put a huge spotlight on the inequities that we knew we had, and we had not acted as a country. And so
it's almost like we had multiple pandemics at once when you really look at, what happened in terms of Black Lives Matter and now Stop Asian Hate. And actually that leads, really into this idea that, a focus of inclusion has been such an essential part of your life and of your platform. And one of the things I love is that you've been especially active in formalizing governmental relationships with the representatives from the Tohono O'odham and the Paskiyaki nations. And I want to know, what do those efforts look like? And in your eyes, how can this multicultural approach lead to a better understanding and a better, if I can say, American identity?
I have, I'm the definition of intersectional, right? Mm-hmm. Layers of identity. As a woman and a brown woman of color, as a first generation daughter of immigrants living on the borderlands. Really, I grew up speaking Spanish and then went into school and learned English at school. And so the identity that I carry is multifaceted and connected to the borderlands and connected to the two countries where I grew up, right? Sonora, Mexico, and Arizona. And the wonderful thing about it is that here in the Sonoran Desert, the Sonoran Desert covers two countries. It doesn't care about artificial borders. And so my family, when I tell people, like, my family has been living in the Sonoran Desert for 6 generations now. People are surprised. But when I say I'm the daughter of immigrants, they're like, what is she talking about? So the Sonoran Desert covers both Arizona and Sonora, and my family has been here in the Sonoran Desert for the past 6 generations. And the reason that is important is because in the Sonoran Desert, our identity is also connected to the Yaqui people and the Tohono O'odham people. And the respect that we have, my family at least, has for the knowledge and the culture and the language and the history of the connection that the Yaqui people and the Tohono O'odham people have to this land is very, very important. And so for me, as I make policy decisions, I want to make sure that the recognition of the original people of this land is front and center in how we view the borderlands and how we view Tucson, Arizona, which, by the way, the word Tucson is derived by a Tohono O'odham word. It means black mountain. It's Chukchon. And so we are in the shadow of the Black Mountain as the city. That's where we were born. That's where our city was born, Chukchon. And so in my relationship building with the chairman of the Basquayaki tribe and the Tohono O'odham Nation, I want to recognize their flags in our city hall. I want to recognize their land. And that we in Tucson, we are just a visitor here in their native land.
That's it's such an important role model really for the rest of the country, because it's of course not just a border issue. It's an issue that this country has at large. And that really leads me to, you kind of answered it, but this idea of living on the border and how that infuses your daily practice and your life, but also how as Tucsonians, I know there had been a bid for Tucson to be a sanctuary city, and that was voted down on perhaps the understanding that it's a kind of a national issue. But my question is, how do sanctuary practices kind of be, how are they threaded in, and how do we support border communities like Nogales that are often really at the forefront of national issues and have so little, infrastructure?
Well, I was born in Yuma and grew up in Somerton, Arizona, and that was 10 minutes away from the border. I have family on both sides of the border, and in Sonora and in Arizona. And as I was growing up, we would leave, and in 10 minutes, we were visiting family on the other side of the border, right?
Yeah.
El
otro lado.
El otro lado. And, we wanted to go eat really delicious tacos, and then we just got on our cars and visited family and went to the taquito place and the hot dog place. And when I approach immigration issues, I approach it as like, nobody in Washington, D.C. understands the life on the border because they don't live it, and they don't understand that it is one community.
When I was a kid, there was no wall like that.
No,
it didn't exist in this way. We used to call it the Disney Wall when it went up, because it was just so out of this world that this could happen.
Yeah, and most of the border didn't have like a wall, right? It was just and you'd move back and forth from on the, both sides of the border, the family on both sides. So as I approach immigration, being first generation, born here, I connect to family, and I do not see immigrants and asylum seekers as others. I see them as family on the other side. And so the city of Tucson has a rich history of being a sanctuary city, right? Back in the early 80s, it was the original sanctuary city, is where the sanctuary movement was born, out of different organizations and churches and church leaders that gave rescue and respite to asylum seekers and immigrants that were moving through our border to go into the United States to seek respite and refuge from Central America. So we are an original sanctuary city. This is where it was born. And so I approach our policy as a city of Tucson. When I sat on the council, we declared our city an immigrant welcoming community. We changed policy in the face of SB 1070. And we really gave direction to our police department and our city manager to make policy that didn't otherize immigrants in our community, that included them as residents of our city.
I want to take another question. I just have a few left. This one is a little bit personal. Every time we do these episodes, we like to have a prompt, an artistic prompt. And so there was one that actually I really wanted to show you. It just aired on PBS. And it's a documentary that I co-produced with a good friend of mine named Murat Eyuboglus. And we worked with a conservationist who's really specialized in the desert and ecology, and the work is called The Colorado, and it spans in 9 chapters the importance of the Colorado River through history. And of course, our drinking water here in Arizona is 90% from the Colorado River. And so I wanted to choose this small excerpt, this chapter, so that the film is actually narrated by the Oscar winner Marc Rylance. And this chapter talks about the importance of water to farming, but it frames it through personal stories. And so this is a story that could have been many stories about a young man who had the ability to fly like a bird in terms of his running. He had been accepted into the Olympics, but at this moment, he stays to take care of his mother. And so the clip that we're about to listen to really gets to the idea that sometimes through art, if you touch the heart, you can reach a level of activism that can almost be more instantaneous. And so just a few statistics that I want to read for our audience before we see the clip. 1 in 8 Arizona residents is a first-generation immigrant. Over 250,000 U.S. citizens in Arizona live with at least one family member who is undocumented. And 1 in 6 Arizona workers is an immigrant, and state industries like agriculture and construction depend on an even greater share of immigrants. So the question after you listen to these 2 minutes is, what was growing up like with immigrant parents as farmers, and what has it meant to you as a leader?
Coach, I told her you'd take me to college to run track and maybe go far. She said, go now, no vale quedar where you are. That day she was picking up a field that was a quarter mile long. She was faint, something was terribly wrong. Give me your medicine, give me your medicine, I will do the best that we never.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to that.
That was wonderful and powerful. That was wonderful and powerful. Well, I see the faces that I saw growing up, right? I worked in the fields myself. A lot of people don't know that.
I did not know that.
And so, helping my parents and seeing my siblings. I'm the youngest of 6 siblings, and I have 4 sisters and a brother, and then just all the equipment that you have to use to be able to do the job, right? Cover yourself up, gloves, and
Right.
I did that. I picked lettuce, and my siblings did as well. And if we couldn't, because we were younger, we helped. Either we, we were on the sidelines because we had no daycare, right?
Right.
So in the vacations or summer breaks, we were on the sidelines, or we helped at home with all of it. But I remember growing up and living that life, which is a very respectable, by the way, very
So much
respectable
dignity.
and dignity and
Yeah.
hard.
Yeah.
Hard work, living through it myself. And really it was working on the fields that convinced me to go to college. But it's incredibly important work. Something that the pandemic also made us realize, right? That the front line,
Yeah.
that the people that are actually feeding us day in, day out, are not valued enough.
No, and they're often treated as invisible.
Are not paid well. They
Yeah.
don't have health insurance. They're not taken care of. And it's incredibly difficult work.
Do you see a direct, one of my last questions was, just in terms of this role model that you are for so many women in terms of, being a first, right? First Latina mayor of Tucson, and what that means. And I'm wondering if you see a direct line from your experiences in the past. And also now, you're such a figure. What would you have said to yourself when you were younger that would, that would allow you to see where you are right now? And is there a direct line in terms of where you are now as a leader?
There's a direct line in that I never really, when I was growing up, I'd never really imagined myself to be an elected official, right? Or a leader. The direct line is that I've never been able to lose, my dad passed away about 5 years ago, but he always would tell us, his kids, like, don't ever forget where you come from, because you will know where you need to go if you know where you come from. And so, the immigrant
powerful.
rights, the worker rights, the equity, always has been ingrained in me, and that's what I focus all my policy work on, right? And climate change is very related to inequities.
Absolutely.
Because climate change affect the front lines. Those people that are working out in the fields, they are affected by heat. They are affected by pesticides. And so, I just, that's the one correlation that I could say that I saw in my mom and my dad, the love of community, the love of family, and the love to serve others. And so, as I grew up and developed myself, that core never really has left me, and has always dictated where I go in there. And that includes even art, the love of art, the love of nature, is something that I grew up with. And in those long 12, 14-hour days in the fields, there was always time for people to sing and bring out a guitar and focus on that art, and being able to bring life to the people that were on the fields with just, singing and a guitar. And so the love of art and nature and all of that comes from the very core of who I am and what I did when I was growing up, and who my parents are and where they come from. So it's all connected, but I never really dreamed of being an elected official, never really dreamed of ever once being the mayor of the city of Tucson, being the first woman.
So it's just one step at a time.
And I stand on the shoulders of so many other women that I love and admire, that came before me. So it is truly an honor.
My last question to you is, this is a podcast about hope.
These have been some hopeless times, and we ask all of our special guests, where are you finding hope right now?
I am finding hope in what we have in front of us, that we have the first woman as
Yes.
vice president and woman of color, daughter of immigrants, that understands
It's huge.
what we carry and the value that we bring into our country. I'm hopeful that there's investment in working families and children, in art, in education. I'm hopeful that we have a president that believes in climate change and wants to invest in resiliency and green job creation, and really doing something about what the effects of climate change are in communities of color and low-income communities, who are at the front lines of receiving the impact of climate change. I'm hopeful for those things, and being in a position of being mayor, of being able to effect change in our city that will take us in a progressive direction.
It's so exciting.
And being able to have a front and center the equity issue that that affects this country and so many people in so many different ways.
And is so needed here at the border. So
Yes.
we are very
Yes.
lucky to have you, and so lucky to have you on our podcast. And fue un honor inmenso. Espero de conocerte un día.
Muchas gracias, Paola.
Thank you so much.
Wow.
She's a bright light.
So incredible.
So many gems.
Right.
So many.
Yeah.
It was just really profound. You know, it's funny as she talks, and this idea of, she exemplified how movement then influences policy, just in her body, right? In the way that our work is, when we think about cultural movements are about movement that births culture. If we think about Great Migration, jazz,
Right.
I don't know, other migration, cultural movements, hip hop even, right? But how this was a really direct tie to policy change within her DNA.
Right.
That was it was just powerful and very straightforward, just so clear cut, really powerful.
And there was a purity in her wanting to lead, which I was very drawn to, because so often people want to lead because of power.
Yes.
And what you see instead in her is, no, I'm actually doing this for my community.
Yeah.
And that I
Right.
thought was it's such a thing, I think, for people who are in leadership positions to really think about, that you are in a service position.
Yeah.
That's right.
You're not in a power position. You're
That's right.
serving.
That's
And you have
right.
to know who you're serving. And I took that really deeply.
That's right.
The idea, I agree with both of you and Kamilah, this observation of humanity as policy, that
Yeah.
Love that.
and the dignity of labor.
Right.
And Kamilah knows this because I've been under her care as a director. When I was a younger artist, sweat was very much a part of my aesthetic. Sweat was part of my belief system as an artist, that there was something about the chemical transformation that was taking place in my body that mirrored the psychological and spiritual transformation that I was trying to pull out of the narrative. And I was an artist who, in the lineage of Entezaki Shange, was someone who used my body as part of the poem.
Right.
That the body language and the written language, that the written language was kind of the straightforward, literal pronouncement of meaning, and that the body language was the metaphor, was the allegory, and that a lot of my aesthetic was built on exhaustion. that for me as performer, and hopefully for audience as witness, there was something about me kind of falling apart that was also part of what I was trying to convey. And that is due in large part to ancestral movement.
Right.
And ancestral migration, a mirroring of the sweat and the labor of the people that came before me. So when she talked about picking lettuce, and you know, we're closer to the equator. We put on all this heavy equipment that not only adds weight to our bodies, but it adds degrees of temperature. You know, people get pissed off because they're in air conditioned scenarios and they have to wear masks. Well, try being under the sun and picking cotton or tobacco or lettuce or strawberries or whatever it is, and her tying all of that labor, and you, Paola, as interlocutor, tying that labor, that sweat, that movement back to dignity, back to humanity. And now as a politician, she takes those lessons with her and embeds that sense of humanity and dignity as policy.
Right.
Well, that is movement. It is legislative movement. And it's really just incredible to hear.
I also, you know, was really, you know, this idea, today's Earth Day. And I didn't think about that when we were doing this, you know, this episode, but it's so interesting to me, you know, when she talks about the, you know, who the kind of who climate change affects the most.
Yeah.
And I think that's a lens that we really need to think about, that I don't think people think about often enough. You know, is who, you know, who are the pesticides affecting? Who is the, you know, who is this climate change really affecting? And it made me think about something that I read that I just really quickly want to read to both of you. It's so interesting about, see if I can find it, about regenerative systems. So it's this study from the University of Kansas, and it says, it talks about interdisciplinarity and about the complex world and how we can kind of think of creating a regenerative global community. And it says, for example, imagine a healthy and beautiful city that generates its own renewable energy, returns all water back to nature as clean or cleaner than when it arrived, operates without waste, protects and regenerates natural systems and species. Without designers, none of this would be realized. And this idea of like trying to impose that thought onto our artistic systems, right? What would it look like if we were creating artistic systems that were, you know, that were reflecting society, but regenerating also and giving back?
Yeah.
And it was interesting because that model made me really think about how can we heal?
Yeah. I mean, that is the gospel of our podcast in so many ways, right? Like, the public healing, the healing apparatus, the culture as part of an integrative medicinal system, the infrastructure of hope, the infrastructure of inspiration as healing agent. All of that is ecological.
Yeah, that's right.
All of it is is a cycle. I love that you're pointing that out.
That's great.
Yeah, I think we're also in a place where, you know, you've done this incredible interview with the mayor of a border town. We've been talking about the contested sites, the contested site of the border and the people who occupy one side or the other. I love when she talked about my family on the other side.
On the other side, right.
I know, it gives me chills.
Yeah.
Right.
And, you know, sometimes men I pass by on the street, my family on the other side. You know, I live in the 10th floor of a building. When I come down from the 10th floor, that's my family on the other side. You know, if not for grace and for ancestral movement, my family on the other side is sometimes my family on the other side of an aesthetic.
Right.
You know,
that's right.
all these ways. And then what we're asked to do as culture makers is, yes, to regenerate, but also to think in terms of a different kind of geometry, where we are not segmented by sides, where we see a composite whole and do our very best to actually connect within a kind of full circle of experience, where we don't draw these sharp lines between disciplines or between manifestations of leadership, where we actually take those borders away to help each other see each other.
And both of them said something that I really need to think about deeply, which is that I have always believed that if I architect something, it can happen. But really, what needs to happen is that we need to take one step at a time.
Sure.
And that change, especially in moments like this, actually have to happen not slowly in that we'll put it off, but actually methodically, where there is a culture of collaboration that's built, that where you have to learn each other's languages, which I think is very germane to the border, right? Which is that when you have such different life experiences, you may not speak that same language. Well, you have to set up a system that is going to have to be modular, and it's going to have to change, and it's going to look messy, and you have to live in that broth.
And then somehow, in the midst of all that mess, right, there is kernels of beauty that exudes from the stew. Right? Somehow, in the midst of all of that.
And those are those moments, right, that keep you going.
We want to transition. You know, we're talking movement. We're talking movements. We're talking borders. We're talking journeys. And we wanted to cite one of our favorite authors, Isabel Wilkerson, and her seminal work, The Warmth of Other Suns, and talk a little bit about the migrant's journey, or from the kind of launching point of hope that for some species, butterflies, dolphins, whales, sometimes there are many species that move for survival. There are many species that move for reproduction. Humans also are species that move for survival. But very often they move out of a kind of optimism that there might be something better on the other side of the journey. And for many people who left the South after being imported as enslaved people here, generations later, there was the liberty to move in search of something. Wilkerson writes, many of the people who left the South never exactly sat their children down to tell them these things, tell them what happened and why they left, and how they and all this bloodkin came to be in this northern city or western suburb, or why they speak like melted butter and their children speak like footsteps on pavement, prim and proper, or clipped and fast like the New World itself. Some spoke of specific and certain evils. Some lived in tight-lipped and cheerful denial. Others simply had no desire to relive what they had already left.
The facts of their lives unfurled over the generations like an overwrapped present, a secret told in syllables. Sometimes the migrants dropped puzzle pieces from the past while folding the laundry or stirring the cornbread, and the children would listen between cereal commercials and not truly understand until they grew up and had children and troubles of their own. And the ones who had half listened would scold and kick themselves that they had not paid better attention when they had the chance. Wilkerson's words are truly a balm, a solve in this moment as we think about migrations, as we think about movement. She's influenced so much and so many. I mean, this book was obviously critically acclaimed. but in a really succinct and broad way, told a very epic story. Um, we want to share another piece that was also influenced by Wilkerson's words. And this piece is the work of the artist, composer Carlos Simon. This was a piece that was commissioned by the Sphinx organization. And that was also inspired by Isabel Wilkerson's Warmth of Other Suns, performed by Met musicians. So let's share a little bit of that piece as well.
Right on.
Such depth, and what a journey I think we felt moving through that piece.
And not for nothing, man. There's a long history of Black folk in classical music, but you want to talk about a journey?
Yeah.
And talk about
and
the
Jessie
capture.
Montgomery, first Black woman at the Chicago Symphony, as composer in residence. It's been tragically slow.
And Carlos Simon himself is just named the composer in residence.
That's right.
At the Kennedy Center.
It's
and
amazing.
I am very proudly collaborating with him on an opera, on a short opera for the Washington National Opera, and also as part of our cartography project.
That piece was exquisite. It had these conversations, and I couldn't help but, the reading that you two did just right before, that was playing through my head as I was listening. But there was something, just like these momentous chords, that really told you the gravity, but then also the lightness the lightness of being. I don't know. There was something, these kind of extremes in the work, which were really beautiful, very powerful. And, I wonder, we talked a little bit about this before in our conversations, this idea of secrecy that gets passed on through generations, and why, what does that do to protect the next generation? And I'm curious, Kamilah, if you could talk a little bit about that in terms of perhaps your own experience or just, your understanding of it.
Well, when I think about thinking about the piece, thinking about secrecy, and thinking about the migrants movement, the immigration or migration, it takes a great deal of courage, flexibility. And in some cases, how do we make ourselves lighter for the journey?
That's great.
Wow.
What do we
powerful.
leave behind? What might be too heavy of a burden to carry along this what is already a treacherous journey? Is the only way that I can kind of contextualize, my family, and just thinking about even just my own family stories. Just recently, I was on another podcast about lineage, and I thought I was sharing what I knew was the truth about who my great grandparents were, until my mother heard it and corrected me. And I was like, but I never knew that. And she said, yes, because we never told you. And it was a secret that could have been shrouded in shame, right? And I think there are, again, I think, and then as it was an effort to protect, an effort to be made light, right? As future generations to be made light for your own journey. But sometimes that's not always, the best. Well, look, we do what we can with what we have, but
Exactly.
yeah, it's interesting. It's really
That's really
interesting. It's
powerful.
interesting when we think about secrets and travel and movement.
Yeah, and the secrets that we've used words like shame and also words like dignity. We've talked about barbed wire,
Right.
and razor wire. We've also talked about humanity and freedom. And inherent in this podcast, this discussion, you incredible women, our various family journeys, inherent in all of this is a yearning for freedom. I almost always go back to Langston Hughes. I go back to the body. I go back to the feeling that I have in my body when I watch Ailey dancers. How the feeling that I've had at times of moving and not coming down, the feeling of freedom that I feel in the music. And part of this discussion has traveled through the idea of duress and struggle, the notion that the walls are closing in. And yet somehow people keep coming, people keep moving, people keep searching. People want better. Better actually is part of the kind of genetic impulse to survive. For some of us, to survive means standing still. But for many of us, survival means moving to the next and being chased, impelled by the wind of your family history to get us a little bit further.
That's right.
And as parents, we may not be fully doing our jobs if we kind of engender among our children a propensity to be satisfied with where they are. And as leaders, we're definitely not doing our job if we're not pushing our institutions to be better than when we founded them.
Right. And also, I think in that DNA of being people who move, there's this idea Every time you create something that you're creating, you feel anyway that you're creating from nothing, right? You're restarting an entire process, rebuilding all these tools. And there's also a little bit of an irreverence, right? And I think that's also part of being someone who changes things, is that you have to have that irreverence in you to think that you can change things, that you can survive, that you can struggle against. And so I'm curious, put it to both of you. What are what do we see as some of the applicable tools in some of the stories that we've heard today about borders and crossing and secrecy that we can translate to our life as artists and leaders?
To me, it's the notion, particularly that Mayor Regina Romero, that her DNA became policy, and having that amount of faith and fortitude in her leadership, in her voice, and her legacy, right? That was extremely powerful to me. And something I think I'm now even searching for, what is it that I'm bringing? Me personally, my journey, within my DNA, that I'm bringing to affect my own style of leadership and or institution. It's a big question.
That is powerful.
And then I think for me, I'm remembering the story of Evan Corey and the studio that was opened up at the border, and this notion of art at a charged and contested intersection. That there's the color, the sculpture, the intuition, investigation, and the seeking that, like a diamond, the kind of most important and urgent art is birthed under pressure. That comes out of the stress of the things that are closing in around it, and the humanity in wanting to make something beautiful inside of a place and at a place that is wrapped in this cloak of an insidious narrative. That what artists do is they find themselves in these charged places and make beauty out of contested sites.
That is so beautiful.
Paola, how about you?
Yeah.
Oh, last night I went to go see my first show. I had one, like my own string quartet perform, but it was not in New York City. And to me, living in New York City is about music. It's like this is why I can be here and not in nature. And it's that I get to be around music. And so I went to see a show, and somebody came up to me and they said, "So when is National Sawdust opening?" And I was like, "Oh my God." I was like, "We haven't closed. I mean, we've been doing art since like March, we haven't closed." But they want to know when the doors are opening. And I was just thinking, I don't know when it's going to open, because what I implore institutions to do right now, and I'm not talking to both of you, but institutions that are legacy institutions, is that this is the time to take time and to recalibrate and to not come back the way we were. And so I think that idea of like change one step at a time, but also like really thinking about who your community is and why you're doing it, and if you're the right person to do it. I mean, these are questions that white people in power have to ask themselves, not to escape and to like give the problem to somebody else, right? Because that's also, but to say, what does it really mean to thread community? What would it mean to build a city that could regenerate itself? Well, let's impose that on an institution. So that's kind of, I think, what I took from all of this, right? Which is that we're at this really big intersection, and there's a lot to think about in all these beautiful images that are running in my mind.
Well, with that being said, Paola, I mean, it's apropos ending on that. I just want to thank you both, Paola and Marc, for your brilliance today in the conversation, and Paola particularly for opening up your world to us.
Yes.
that was really brilliant. And thank you to our featured guest, Mayor Regina Romero and Evan Corey. Today you heard music composed by Paola Prestini, Carlos Simon, and Violeta Parra, and beautiful performance by Magos Herrera, Ed Simon, Adam Cruz, and Joe Martin. Thank you to the Met Orchestra musicians, Angela Gwen Shen, Julia Choi, Chihiro Allen, and Julia Bruskin, and a roomful teeth, Glenn Kothche, Jeffrey Zeigler, featured in Murat Eyuboglus film, The Colorado. And on behalf of my co-hosts, Paola Prestini and Marc Bamuthi Joseph, I'm Kamilah Forbes, and this is Act of Hope. Thank you all for listening.
Peace.
Thank you both.
Bye, everybody.